My name is Audra, and at 31 years old, I learned that the most dangerous people in your life rarely look like threats. They don't show up with a warning. They sit across from you at dinner, they smile at your wedding photos, and they spend years mistaking your patience for weakness, right up until the moment that patience runs out. My husband and his family had decided, long before I clearly understood it, that I was a background character in their story. A quiet, unremarkable footnote. My mother-in-law had spent the better part of 3 years treating me like a tolerated inconvenience rather than a daughter-in-law. She ran a construction development company in the Toronto area, and she treated that company like a second religion. My husband worked as a project manager inside that same company, which meant he had spent our entire marriage performing his loyalty to her rather than to me. And my brother-in-law, the eldest son, the one who handled the government contracts and the licensing and the federal relations, he was the golden one, the loud one, the one who believed a room full of people existed purely to reflect his own importance back at him. They thought I was a paralegal with the federal government, low level, something to do with reviewing permit documentation. My husband had told his family as much, and I had let him because the truth was something I was not permitted to share with anyone outside my chain of command. Before I tell you the rest of this, leave me a comment and let me know where you're watching from tonight. And if you've ever had to sit quietly in a room full of people who had no idea who you actually were, hit like. This one is for you. The Sick Kids Foundation Gala was held on the third Thursday of October, in a ballroom on the 32nd floor of a Bay Street tower with an unobstructed view of Lake Ontario. My mother-in-law had secured 2 tables near the front. She served on the foundation's advisory board, which she mentioned to every new person she met within the first 40 seconds of any conversation. The tables were dressed in white linen and cream roses. A string quartet played near the bar. The room was full of exactly the kind of people my mother-in-law spent her whole life trying to impress. Federal cabinet ministers, senior Bay Street partners, hospital executives and real estate developers who controlled enough square footage to fill a small city. I wore a navy dress I'd owned for 2 years. Simple, nothing that drew attention, that was intentional. My name card had been placed at the far corner of our table, not beside my husband, not near the center, but at the edge, tucked between a retired accountant and an empty chair. The kind of placement you give someone when you want to signal to the room that they don't quite belong. My mother-in-law had done it without comment and without embarrassment, which was the most revealing thing about it. My husband barely looked at me all evening. He was busy moving from conversation to conversation, pressing his business card into the palms of people whose names he'd rehearsed in the car on the way over. He laughed a little too loudly at the right jokes. He offered to refresh people's drinks. He was performing the way he always performed, checking the faces around him for approval before he committed to any expression of his own. My mother-in-law made her rounds through the room with the practiced grace of a woman who had studied social climbing the way other people study medicine. She stopped at our table to introduce the guests nearby, and when she reached me, she placed one perfectly manicured hand on my shoulder and said to the woman beside her, "A senior partner at a Bloor Street law firm. And this is my son's wife, Audra. She's with the federal government. Something to do with permits and paperwork. You know how it is, good steady hours, decent benefits." She laughed warmly as if she were doing me a favor by including me in the sentence at all. The senior partner offered me a polite smile and turned away. My husband, standing within clear earshot, said nothing. He picked up his glass and turned back to the conversation he'd been having. I took a slow sip of sparkling water and watched the room. 3 seats to my left, slightly apart from our group, sat a man I recognized immediately. Not from a photograph, from something more specific, from the distinctive federal judicial pin on his lapel, and from the fact that his signature had appeared on 11 sealed warrant applications I had read in a secure briefing room over the course of the previous 14 months. His name was Justice Callahan. He had been appointed to the Federal Court of Canada 9 years earlier, and he was the presiding justice on every warrant that had authorized the investigation I had been quietly running from inside my own marriage. I did not acknowledge him, he did not acknowledge me, that was the arrangement. My brother-in-law arrived late as he always did when it mattered. Not because he was busy, because he liked an entrance. He was 43 years old and had spent most of those years treating every room he walked into as a personal stage. He dropped into his chair with the easy confidence of someone who assumed the best seat was always going to be reserved for him, and within 10 minutes he had pulled the table's conversation toward himself entirely. He talked about the new development his company had just broken ground on north of the city. Government-subsidized housing, federal CMHC funding, he said proudly, spreading his hands wide. 48 units. His company had won the contract over 4 other bidders. He leaned back and said this as if it were a personal character achievement, rather than a procurement result. I kept my face neutral and my posture easy. I had reviewed every page of that contract. I knew exactly how they'd won it. As the main course was cleared, the conversation at our end of the table grew louder and more self-satisfied. My brother-in-law had been watching me at the edge of the group all evening with the particular expression he used for things he found mildly contemptible. He finally turned the spotlight directly in my direction. He picked up his wineglass loosely, the way someone does when they want to look relaxed while delivering something pointed. He said loudly enough for the 2 tables nearest us to hear clearly, "So, Audra, still stamping forms down at the federal building?" Several guests turned to look. I met his eyes and said, "Something like that." He tilted his head with a slow, satisfied smile. "Must be nice," he said, "a job where nothing really depends on you, no pressure. You just show up, you process your little stack of paperwork, you go home at 4:30. He paused just long enough to let the image settle. Some people need that, not everyone's built for the real work. My mother-in-law, who had come to stand behind his chair, pressed her lips together in a small, approving smile. My husband turned slightly to gauge the reaction of the man sitting to his left before he joined in. That was his tell. He always checked whether it was safe before he committed to an opinion. He said, "She's not really built for high-stakes environments. And that's fine, not everyone is." He said it lightly, as if it were a kindness. A generous thing to say about a person sitting 1 seat away from you who had promised to be your partner. Something settled in my chest at that moment. Not anger, exactly. Something colder. The kind of certainty that arrives when you've been waiting for a long time and you finally understand that the waiting is done. My brother-in-law wasn't finished. He pressed his palms flat on the table in a gesture of theatrical generosity and looked around at the assembled guests. Some of us are out here managing hundreds of millions in federal housing contracts, construction timelines, union negotiations, dealing with Ottawa Queen's Park. He glanced at me. And some of us are reviewing permit amendments. A few people laughed softly, the uncomfortable kind of laugh that comes from not knowing whether to be uneasy. I took a slow breath. My hands were perfectly still in my lap. I was thinking, in that moment, about the encrypted evidence drive sitting in a secure locker inside a federal building 4 blocks from where we were sitting. I was thinking about the 14 months I had spent carefully mapping every dollar that moved through my mother-in-law's company. I was thinking about the Shell Corporation, registered out of Mississauga. The falsified inspection reports my brother-in-law had signed. The CMHC subsidies rerouted through a numbered company registered to a relative in Brampton. I could say none of it. So I sat quietly and I let him finish, and I watched the room the way I had been trained to watch rooms. Justice Callahan had gone very still. He had set his fork down on the rim of his plate. He held his wineglass without drinking from it, and he was watching my brother-in-law with an expression I had seen once before, in a document transcript from a closed warrant hearing, described as the moment the presiding justice understood the scope of what he was authorizing. My mother-in-law said something about how fortunate her family was to have such driven, accomplished men. She said it deliberately, without looking at me. Justice Callahan placed his glass down. He turned his head, and his gaze moved across the table and settled directly on me. Not the way a stranger looks at a stranger. The way a person looks when they recognize something underneath the surface, when the discipline and the years of careful concealment become suddenly visible to someone who knows exactly what they're looking for. The table had gone momentarily quiet in a natural lull in conversation. Into that quiet, Justice Callahan said, "Are you the case lead on the Bridgepoint file?" The question landed the way a stone lands in still water, not with a splash but with a spreading change in everything around it. The words case lead and Bridgepoint file belonged to sealed affidavits and closed-door warrant hearings. They had no business in a Sick Kids Foundation ballroom on a Thursday evening in October. My husband stopped moving. He was holding his glass halfway to his mouth and he simply stopped. My mother-in-law's hand gripped the back of her son's chair. I held Justice Callahan's gaze. I answered the question the only way I was permitted to. Yes, Your Honor. The title alone did the work. You don't say Your Honor across a charity gala dinner table unless you know exactly who is sitting across from you and what authority they carry. The guests who understood the terminology understood immediately. The ones who didn't understood something had shifted anyway, the way you understand when the temperature in a room changes even before you can name the reason. Justice Callahan nodded once, deliberate, unhurried. He picked up his linen napkin, folded it carefully and placed it beside his plate. He pushed his chair back and stood. He did not look at my mother-in-law, though she made a small, desperate sound and said his name. He did not look at my brother-in-law who had gone the color of old concrete. He did not look at my husband. He looked at me with the calm, absolute recognition of a senior jurist confirming something he had needed to confirm. Carry on, counsel, he said. And then he walked out of the ballroom. The silence that followed was the worst kind. Not the silence of a room that doesn't know what happened, but the silence of a room full of very intelligent, very well-connected people who know that something significant has just occurred and are rapidly calculating what it means. The Bay Street partners, the hospital executive 2 tables over, the federal staffer near the window, who had gone rigid the moment he heard the words case lead. They were all excellent at reading rooms. They were all reading this one carefully. My brother-in-law opened his mouth and closed it again. My mother-in-law looked at me for the first time all evening with something that was not contempt. It was fear, just for a moment. Then her face went very still. My husband looked at me as if he had never seen me before. I picked up my water glass, finished what was left of it, and set it gently down on the table. The drive home took 23 minutes. I watched the clock on the dashboard and kept my breathing even, and thought about everything that still needed to happen. My husband didn't speak for the first 8 minutes. Then he said I had humiliated him. He said I had ruined the most important event of his mother's year by doing whatever I had just done with that judge. He said it like I had planned it specifically to embarrass him, like it was a trick. I told him I had answered a professional question from a member of the federal court. He said that wasn't an answer. He hit the steering wheel with the flat of his hand and said he was my husband, and he had a right to know what I actually did, what the Bridgepoint file was, what all of it meant. I told him I wasn't in a position to discuss an active file. He was quiet for a long stretch after that, and then he said something I don't think he meant to say out loud. He said, "You were never supposed to be like this." I understood exactly what he meant. Not aggressive, not difficult, not like someone with her own authority that had nothing to do with him. He had married me because he believed I was smaller than him. He needed me to stay that way. Without it, he didn't know quite who he was. When we got home, my mother-in-law's car was already in the driveway. My brother-in-law was with her. They had come straight from the gala and were standing in the cold October air outside our front door like a wall. My brother-in-law said I had engineered the whole evening deliberately. He said he would be filing a complaint with the Law Society of Ontario. He mentioned connections at Queen's Park. My mother-in-law said I was a manipulative woman who had deceived her son from the very beginning. My husband went inside without saying anything to me, and when he came back, he was holding a canvas weekend bag. He set it on the porch steps without looking at me and told me I could find somewhere else to sleep. I looked at the 3 of them. My mother-in-law with her arms crossed, my brother-in-law with his jaw set, my husband standing slightly behind them both, needing their permission to be angry, and I thought, 3 years is long enough. I picked up the bag and walked to my car. My handling officer had arranged a secure address 40 minutes outside the city 3 months earlier, once we had identified that my operational cover would eventually collapse. The room was plain and clean, and had a heavy deadbolt and a secure communications line. I sat on the edge of the bed and called my supervising attorney at the PPSC. She said, "We figured something had shifted. The Callahan sighting at the gala got flagged. What's your status?" I said, Cover is burned, evidence is complete, I'm ready to proceed, she said. 72 hours, we'll have the arrest warrants and the account freeze orders staged. There are things I had never told my husband during 3 years of marriage. Things I was not legally permitted to share, and things I had chosen not to share because, in the end, the distinction didn't matter. I am a senior Crown prosecutor with the Public Prosecution Service of Canada. I have been for 6 years. My focus is federal financial crime, specifically fraud involving government procurement and housing subsidies. 18 months before that evening at the Sick Kids Gala, I was seconded to a joint RCMP Financial Crime Division task force with a specific mandate: gather evidence from within a domestic environment that had organic access to the target organization. The target organization was my mother-in-law's company. They had been siphoning CMHC housing subsidies through a network of shell corporations for nearly 4 years. My brother-in-law was the operational center. He held the engineering certification that allowed him to sign off on building inspections, and he had been falsifying those reports since the first subsidized project. My mother-in-law managed the financial architecture. Money moved through numbered companies, flowed between accounts across 3 provinces, and landed in assets held under her name and those of relatives. The scheme had allowed them to win federal contracts, collect the subsidies, under-deliver on construction quality, and pocket the difference. My husband's knowledge was partial. He knew the numbers didn't quite add up, the way you always know something is wrong in a house you live in, even when you choose not to open the door where the problem lives. That choice would matter later, in ways he hadn't yet begun to calculate. I had spent 18 months building the case from the inside. Every dinner at that house, every document I had been left alone near, every conversation I'd absorbed while being treated as furniture. The RCMP had done the rest. The evidence was complete. The warrant for the account seizures had been signed 3 weeks earlier under Justice Callahan's authority. The arrest warrants executed the following morning. My brother-in-law was taken from his office. My mother-in-law was arrested at the house in Rosedale before 9 o'clock. 47 accounts were frozen across 3 financial institutions, along with 3 corporate entities and a real estate portfolio assembled over 4 years with diverted federal funding. The charges included federal fraud, conspiracy to defraud the Crown, falsification of inspection records, and money laundering through FINTRAC-designated channels. It was in the news before noon. My husband called while I was at the federal building reviewing the execution reports. I let the first 4 calls go to voicemail. The 5th time I answered. He was outside in the parking lot. He said he'd been there for 2 hours trying to get past the security desk. He sounded like a person who had not slept. He sounded like someone who had spent 2 hours in a concrete parking lot in October, realizing that everything he thought was solid had been liquid all along. He said he hadn't known about all of it. He said he had suspected something wasn't right but had chosen not to look too closely, because looking too closely would have required him to make a choice he wasn't prepared to make. He said he understood now that this was on him, but surely there was something I could do. Some context I could offer, someone I could call, something that would slow any of this down. I walked outside. He was standing near the visitor barrier in his coat, and he looked like someone the wind had reached the inside of. I said, "There's nothing I can do, and even if there were, you made sure of it. Your lawyer's separation agreement, the one designed to cut me off from any claim against your family's assets, it also cut you off from any claim against mine. The waiver runs both ways. You signed it yourself." He stared at me. I don't think he had worked through that particular calculation until that moment, that the document he had used to protect his family's interests had in the end protected only mine. That in his urgency to strip me of any access to the company, he had permanently separated himself from 6 years of a senior Crown's accumulated savings, her investments, her entirely legitimate financial life. I said, "Find a criminal defense lawyer, not a corporate one, call them today." I turned around and walked back through the security doors. The October air was sharp behind me and I breathed it in deeply, the way you breathe when something you've been carrying for a very long time has finally been set down. The hardest thing I worked through in the months that followed wasn't the case, or the depositions, or the long process of testifying in proceedings I had spent 18 months building toward. I had been trained for all of that. The hardest thing was understanding why I had allowed the rest of it. The corner seat at the gala table, the laughing along, the years of watching my husband choose his family's approval over my basic dignity, to continue as long as it had. I told myself I was being strategic, choosing patience over reaction, the way the work had taught me. But there is a difference between strategic patience and disappearing. And I had been disappearing gradually, in that marriage, losing pieces of myself in small increments, the way you lose things and don't notice until you reach for them and find them gone. People who need you to be small are afraid of what you become when you stop agreeing to it. They will call your quiet strength stupidity and your calm submission a character flaw. They will construct an entire reality that requires your smallness as a structural element, because without it, the thing they've built cannot stand. You don't have to prove anything to those people. You don't owe them a performance of your own worth. You just have to know who you are, keep doing the work, and let the truth arrive on its own schedule. It does arrive. It always does. With all its documentation and all its federal authority and all its weight, it arrives, and when it does, no amount of contempt or carefully worded legal agreements can slow it down. I took a new file 6 weeks after the charges were filed. Different city, different case, different cover. I cut my hair slightly shorter and got a reliable used car, nothing showy, just something good on winter roads. I drove north out of the city on a gray Tuesday morning with the heater running and the radio low, and somewhere past Barrie the highway opened up wide, and the sky went that particular shade of Canadian winter gray that I have always found, for reasons I can't fully explain, deeply reassuring. I thought, this is mine, the work, the road, the quiet, clear knowledge of exactly who I am. That has always been mine, and no one in any ballroom, across any dinner table, in any parking lot at dawn, no one ever had the power to take it from me. They just had to figure that out the hard way.